I finally found 3 true school lockdown stories. We send our children to school with the expectation of safety. We imagine it as a sanctuary for learning and growth, a world of fluorescent lights, scuffed linoleum floors, and the familiar chime of a school bell. But for an ever-growing number of students, that bell is being drowned out by a different sound, the cold, disembodied voice that crackles over the PA system, announcing a lockdown. And while the majority of these lockdowns are just drills, the fear they manufacture is devastatingly real. There are countless studies documenting the very real trauma these rehearsals cause, a constant, gnawing reminder of a potential horror lurking just beyond the classroom door. The stories you are about to hear were born in the shadow of that specific, modern fear. I've dredged them from the dark corners of old online forums, from late-night conversations, and from emails sent when the rest of the world is asleep. They are presented as they were told to me, as true accounts from the people who survived them. Now, verifying tales like these is next to impossible. They aren't attached to news articles or official reports. But they persist, like urban legends, because the dread they tap into is so horribly authentic. And one story, in particular, is the reason I started this search. It's a story about a voice that promises an unspeakable end from behind a locked door. But when the police finally arrive, they find an impossible silence and a room that's simply empty. Story 1. This first story comes from a man named Kevin. He was a high school senior in the late 90s, a time before active shooter drills were routine, and long before every student had a cell phone to illuminate a darkened room. Kevin was in his final class of the day, calculus. It was a relaxed environment. The teacher was a laid-back young man who understood everyone was just watching the clock. The afternoon sun streamed through the windows, lighting up lazy dust motes dancing in the air. The only sound was the gentle scratching of pencils on paper during a quiz. It was normal. It was peaceful. Then the door flew open, crashing against the wall with a sound like a gunshot that made every student jolt upright. It wasn't their teacher. It was the school dean, a man known for his unflappable composure. But in that moment, his face was a waxy, bloodless mask. His eyes so wide they looked like they were trying to escape his own head. The panic coming off him was a physical force, sucking the very breath from their lungs. He didn't shout. His voice was a low, strained hiss, and that was infinitely more terrifying. "Lock this door. Now. Kill the lights and get away from the glass. This is not a drill." Before anyone could process the words, he was gone, his footsteps pounding down the hallway. Kevin's teacher, whose name he can no longer recall, reacted on pure instinct. He slammed the heavy door shut, the sound echoing in the sudden silence. His keys rattled for a heart-stopping second before the deadbolt clicked into place. He hit the lights, and the classroom was plunged into a disorienting twilight. The sunlight that had been so warm just moments ago now felt like a hostile spotlight. "Everybody," the teacher whispered, his voice trembling uncontrollably. "Get over here, under the windows, against the wall. Stay down. Do not make a sound." 20 teenagers crawled from their desks, a clumsy, terrified herd moving on primal fear. They pressed themselves against the cool cinder-block wall, their backs to the windows. Kevin's heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. He could hear the girl next to him desperately trying to smother a sob. What was happening? The look on the dean's face had erased any possibility of a prank. The minutes stretched into an eternity, filled only with the sound of their own ragged, shallow breathing. And then, a new sound began. A sound that was somehow worse than screaming. A slow, methodical thump. Thump. Thump on a classroom door down the hall. It wasn't frantic. It It was patient. The sound of something that knew it had all the time in the world. It was getting closer. The class held its breath as the banging stopped at the door of the classroom right next to theirs. They heard a muffled male voice, seething with a rage so profound it felt like it could boil the air. They couldn't make out the words, only the pure, venomous tone. Then the banging started on their door. It was violent. The heavy oak door shuddered in its frame with each impact. Then the screaming began, so close and so clear, it was as if he were standing among them. "I know you're in there! Let me in!" The man on the other side sounded utterly deranged. He twisted the handle so violently Kevin was sure it would snap off. He threw his full body weight against the door again and again. "I'm going to end every single one of you. Do you hear me? All of you!" A girl near Kevin let out a choked whimper. Someone else hissed for her to be quiet. The teacher stood like a statue by the door, his body braced, as if he intended to hold it shut with his own life. The man outside continued his tirade, his voice growing ragged. He wasn't just screaming threats, he was making promises. He whispered through the door, his voice a wet, conspiratorial rasp, describing in obscene detail the things he was going to do to them. The air grew thick and foul, heavy with his words. Then, as abruptly as it began, it was over. The hallway fell completely silent. And that silence was worse. Where did he go? Was he listening? Was he looking for another way in? Every creak of the old building was a footstep. They waited in that suffocating terror for what felt like hours. At last, a sound they had never been so grateful to hear. The distant wail of sirens, growing closer. Soon, the hallway outside was filled with the thud of heavy boots and the sharp crackle of police radios. A calm, authoritative voice called out, "Police! Is everyone in this room okay?" The teacher, his body shaking with relief, managed to call back that they were. After a tense exchange, he unlocked the door, opening it to a corridor swarming with armed officers. They were escorted out, past the other terrified faces peering from classrooms, and into the organized chaos of an evacuation. The official story they received later was that a disturbed individual had gained access to the school, but had fled before police arrived. It was a tidy, sterile explanation that did nothing for the students who had heard that voice promise them death. But the school janitor, an old man who had worked there for 30 years, told a far different story. The legend that circulated for years was that the janitor had taken cover in a small supply closet in that very hallway. He claimed that after the screaming stopped, he heard the closet door creak open. A man reeking of sweat and rage and clutching a massive .44 Magnum slipped inside with him. The janitor said he was so paralyzed with fear he couldn't even draw a breath. The man just stood there with him in the suffocating dark, listening to the approaching police. And then, somehow, in that tiny, cramped space, he simply wasn't there anymore. When police finally cleared the building, the janitor was the only one inside. The man with the gun had dissolved into the shadows, a phantom of pure rage who left behind nothing but a school full of traumatized kids and a story that would infect its halls for decades. A threat that can materialize and then simply vanish is a unique form of terror. But sometimes, the horror isn't a mysterious stranger. Sometimes, it comes from a danger you were warned about, a warning you just didn't have the language to understand. This next story was sent in by a viewer who believes her lockdown was foretold. Story 2. This story comes from a woman named Chloe, and it happened during her freshman year of high school. Her school had one of those enormous multi-purpose rooms, a combination cafeteria, auditorium, and gymnasium. An entire wall was composed of floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the front lawn and the street beyond. It was a rainy spring afternoon. Chloe and her friends were at their lunch table, surrounded by the typical cafeteria noise. Outside, the sky was a bruised, sickly shade of purple. A low rumble echoed through the cavernous room. "Sounds like a big storm's coming," one of her friends noted, her eyes glued to her phone. A few minutes later, another boom. But this one was different. It was sharper, closer. The entire building seemed to vibrate with it. This time, kids looked up, their eyes drawn to the massive windows. That's when teachers and monitors began moving through the room, their attempts at calm so forced it only amplified the growing anxiety. "Okay, everyone, let's move away from the windows," a teacher announced, her voice pitched a little too high. "Everyone, toward the center of the room. Now please." There was a wave of confused grumbling. No one knew what was happening. It didn't have the sterile, practiced feel of a drill. There was a frantic, chaotic energy in the air. They were herded like livestock into the windowless corridor connecting the cafeteria to the main building. They were crammed shoulder to shoulder in the dim, flickering fluorescent light, a sea of confused and frightened faces. It was only then, pressed against a cold locker, that a memory ignited in Chloe's mind with terrifying clarity. It was from months before, around Halloween. One morning, the student body had arrived to find a message smeared across the huge cafeteria windows in a thick, dark red fluid that dripped and coagulated in the morning light. It was messy and savage, and it spelled out 3 words: "Don't come here." The administration had quickly dismissed it as a tasteless senior prank, claiming it was just red paint and corn syrup. The glass was cleaned before second period, and the incident was largely forgotten. But standing in that suffocating hallway, the image of that warning burned behind Chloe's eyes. The concussive booms they'd heard, they hadn't been thunder. They remained in that hallway for nearly an hour. Rumors spread in hushed, frantic whispers. A bomb, a shooter on the roof. The truth, which they would piece together later from news reports, was somehow more intimate and terrifying. A registered sex offender who lived in the neighborhood bordering the school was having a violent, armed standoff with police at his home, just a few streets away. He was threatening to kill himself or any officer who approached. The booms were flashbang grenades police were using. The school was put on lockdown because he had explicitly threatened to flee his house and run to the nearest populated area to take hostages. The nearest, most populated area was their school. He never made it. He was taken into custody and the lockdown was lifted. They were allowed to return to the cafeteria, where their half-eaten lunches and abandoned backpacks sat like a strange, silent monument to a life that had been violently interrupted. But Chloe never saw those windows the same way again. She kept thinking about that bloody message. Was it really just a prank? Or was it a desperate, failed prophecy from someone who knew the monster living just down the street? The most chilling thought was that the warning had been delivered, but they had all been too blind to read it until the monster was already at the gates. That unresolved question, the feeling of a warning that went unseen, is its own kind of horror. But this last story, this is the one that utterly defies explanation. It's a story that suggests some doors are meant to remain locked forever, and that sometimes what disappears is more than just a person. This is the story of the classroom that was there one moment and gone the next. Story 3. This story is different. It doesn't have a single source. It's a mosaic, pieced together from fragmented posts on decaying internet forums and third-hand accounts from a friend of a friend. You will not find a news article or a police report. It has become a piece of digital folklore, a ghost story for the lockdown generation. But every single version tells the same impossible, terrifying tale. The setting is a generic suburban high school, the kind you could find in any town. It's a rainy Tuesday afternoon. Inside a classroom on the second floor, A teacher named Mr. Harrison is attempting to teach the Civil War to 22 bored 16-year-olds. Suddenly, the PA system shrieks to life. A woman's voice, stretched thin with panic, slices through the room. Attention, teachers and students. We are now in a code red lockdown. This is not a drill. I repeat, this is a code red. The speaker cuts out, leaving a silence that feels heavier than sound. Mr. Harrison, a veteran teacher who had been through this dozens of times, moves without hesitation. His face is grim, but his actions are calm and practiced. "You heard her," he says, his voice low and steady. "Let's go. No noise." He strides to the door, shuts it, and the deadbolt slides home with a heavy final thud. He moves to the windows and yanks down the thick vinyl blinds, plunging the room into near-total darkness, lit only by the faint, eerie glow of the emergency exit sign. The students, moving with a familiar, practiced fear, slide from their desks and press themselves against the interior wall, a silent, terrified mass. For 5 minutes there is nothing but the sound of the rain against the glass and the frantic, collective beating of 23 hearts. And then, it starts. A single, hard knock on the door. No one dares to breathe. Mr. Harrison raises a finger to his lips, an unnecessary gesture. Another knock, harder this time. Then, a sudden, violent pounding. It sounds like someone is trying to splinter the door with their bare fists. The wood groans. The metal frame rattles in the wall. Then the screaming begins. It's a man's voice, but the sound is raw, inhuman. A shriek of pure, atomized rage that seems to vibrate in their very bones. "I know you're in there," it howls, the voice cracking with fury. It's so close, it feels like it's already inside the room with them. "Open the door. Open the damn door." The students push themselves harder against the wall, as if trying to merge with it. A boy begins to sob uncontrollably, and the girl next to him clamps a hand over his mouth. Mr. Harrison stands guard by the door, his body coiled and tense, a lone sentinel against the storm. The man outside starts screaming names, and the blood in their veins turns to ice. The names are almost right. "I'm coming for you, Jessica. I see you in there, Mike." Close enough to be impossible, wrong enough to suggest he was seeing a slightly twisted version of their class, a dark reflection on the other side of the door. The onslaught continues for what feels like an eternity. He pounds, he kicks, he screams until his voice is a wet, ragged gasp. And then, mid-scream, the sound is severed. Not faded, not tapered off. It is cut clean, as if a switch has been flipped, plunging the world into a silence so absolute, it is more deafening than the rage it replaced. They stay huddled in the dark, every nerve screaming, waiting for the next sound. 10 minutes pass. 20. 30. Nothing but the rain. Finally, a new sound cuts through the silence, the distant, beautiful wail of sirens. Soon, the hallway is filled with official noises, heavy boots, crackling radios, and a calm, authoritative voice. "This is the police. We are clearing the building. Is anyone in this room?" Mr. Harrison, his voice trembling with relief, calls back that they are all there, all safe. After confirming his identity, the officer gives the all clear. "Okay, sir. The hall is secure. You can open the door." Mr. Harrison takes a deep, shuddering breath. He turns to his students, who look back with wide, tear-streaked faces. He gives them a small, reassuring nod. He walks to the door, his hand shaking as he reaches for the deadbolt. He slides it back. He turns the handle. He opens the door. This is where the official story, if there ever was one, ends. Because the official story is that it was a false alarm. A PA system glitch. Mass hysteria. But that's not what the whispers say. The whispers, the fragmented forum posts, the story told by the supposed cousin of a responding officer. They say that when the police team, guns raised, finally saw that classroom door swing open, they were staring into a perfectly, impossibly empty room. The lights were off. The blinds were drawn. 22 desks sat in silent, neat rows. An open history book lay on the teacher's lectern. The room had been locked from the inside. But there was no Mr. Harrison. There were no 22 students. They were gone. All of them. Police searched the entire school. Every other person was accounted for. But the 23 people from Mr. Harrison's Civil War class had simply ceased to exist inside a locked room on the second floor. The man screaming in the hall was never found. In fact, no one else in the entire school even heard him. The only proof that anything had happened was the code red announcement and an empty classroom that should have been full. The story survives only as a chilling piece of modern folklore, a warning that sometimes, when you lock a door to keep a monster out, you may only be trapping yourself inside with something far, far worse. The line between a true story and a living nightmare is thinner than we think. It's drawn in the suffocating darkness of a locked classroom, in the crushing silence that follows a scream. The stories we tell are reflections of our deepest fears, and few fears are more primal than being trapped and helpless with an unknown threat on the other side of a door. These events may or may not have happened, but the terror is real. It's the same cold dread felt by anyone who has ever had to hide in the dark, listen to the sounds outside, and pray that what's out there doesn't find a way in. What do you think happened in that final classroom? A shared delusion? A tear in reality? Or just a story designed to keep us awake at night? Let me know your theories in the comments. And if you have a true, terrifying story you'd like to share, you can send it to the email address in the description below. You never know, it might be featured in a future video. If you appreciate tales that explore the terrifying space between what's real and what's a nightmare, be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. Thank you for listening.